Hi, everybody. Now that we're done research methods, we can finally start to get into some actual social psychology. I know research methods can be a little dry, but things start to get a little bit more fun from now on, I think. And part of the reason for that is because I'm going to be introducing some concepts that are not necessarily intuitive. In fact, when you first hear about them, they might seem very counterintuitive. You may not want to sort of believe that they're true, but I'm going to try to lay a little bit of a groundwork to build up some of these ideas. Now, when I start talking about social psychology, I'd like starting with the concept of the self. In other words, how do we come to understand ourselves? How do we feel about ourselves? And how do our motivations guide our behavior? This is really fundamental, I think, because as we're going to see, a lot of the phenomena that we're going to talk about later in the course may be difficult to understand unless you understand some of the underlying motivations that we tend to have, that we may not even be aware of. So that's why I think it's really important to start by talking about the self, what drives us, and how we come to understand ourselves. One of the things I do in my in-person class, the first thing I do in this section is I give them a little task to do. And obviously I can't do that here, but I'm going to explain to you what the task is. So what I do first of all is I get half of my class to close their eyes. And the other half of the class, I give them an instruction of what I'm expecting them to do, which is this here. They have to decide whether each word is long or short. And then for about 30 seconds or so, I give them a list of 14 words. After that 30 seconds is up, I then take away that list. And then I switch things around. So the people who just had their eyes open, I now have them close their eyes. And the people who previously had their eyes closed, I now have them open them. And these new people now, they've got a slightly different task. Instead of deciding if each word is long or short, they now have to decide if it describes them. Now, I give them the same list of words in the same order and for the same amount of time, about 30 seconds. So they each have an equal amount of time to study these words and to encode them in memory. Then when the 30 seconds is up and I have everyone open their eyes, I give them a simple task, which is to list as many of the words that they just saw as possible. So they give themselves a point for each word they correctly remembered from that list, and then calculate a score between 0 and 14. And what you find every time I've done this is that the people who were given this task to decide if each word describes them, they report remembering more words than the people who were given the earlier task to decide if each word was long or short. Now, why is that? Well, this is due to something known as the self-reference effect. What the self-reference effect describes is that when we relate things to ourselves, we tend to remember those things better. That's true of words in these lists that I just gave you. So when people try to think if each word describes them, they're relating them to themselves. People tend to remember those words better. Similarly, when we talk about phenomena in class or in lecture, when you hear about phenomena over the course of the semester, if you can relate those concepts to your own life, so if you can recognize when some phenomenon was working in your own life or when it affected a friend of yours or something along those lines, you will tend to remember those phenomena better because it's related to what is known as your self-concept. And when we relate things to our self-concept, we remember them better. And in fact, this is actually a study tip, not just for this class, but for any class that you take. The more you can relate the concept you're learning in that class to yourself, the better able you are to remember them, and consequently, the better able you should perform on exams. Let's look at the self-reference effect a little bit. What this is really saying is that when we come across information that's relevant to ourselves, or when we make information relevant to ourselves, we process that information a little bit differently than other types of information. So, for example, we tend to engage in more of what is known as categorical processing. What this means is that you can kind of think of your brain as having, and this is not exactly how your brain works, but you can kind of think of your brain as having sort of a filing system. And because you have thought about yourself a lot, because you've probably had to describe yourself to others, right? You have a well-defined filing cabinet system, which refers to things that relate to you. Okay. And as a consequence, information that you come across that's relevant to yourself, it's easy to file away. And because it's easy to file away, it's easy to remember that information later on. Okay, that's what I mean when I say that we engage in more of what's known as categorical processing. And at the same time, we also engage in more of what's known as elaborative processing, which refers to the depth at which we think about these concepts. When we think about how a word relates to us, for instance, we have to think about what that word means and how it is reflected in our own behavior. We're processing the meaning of that word at a deeper level. But if you just have to decide if a word is long or short, you don't even have to read the word, right? You're not processing it. You're not thinking about what it means at a deeper level. So by relating things to you, you tend to elaboratively process them. You think about them at a deeper level. And so because of this categorical processing and this elaborative processing, this leads to the self-reference effect. The fact that we tend to remember information related to the self better than other types of information. And the reason I'm mentioning the self-reference effect is because it demonstrates the importance of the self, in this case, to our memory. When you relate things to yourself, you remember it better. So our memory is in part a function of how we conceive of ourselves and how we relate information to ourselves. The self is very important, in other words. And it's not just memory that the self affects. The self affects all sorts of other things as well. In fact, our entire perception of the world is colored by ourself, by who we are, what our past experiences were. Different people can see the same event and interpret it very, very differently because their perceptions are both colored by their past experiences, by who they believe that they are. This is why you can get people who have vast disagreements, even though they're exposed to the same sort of stimulus. And importantly, each person feels as if they're the one that sees the world accurately. And if they're the one that sees the world accurately and you disagree with me, that must mean that you are biased. In other words, we're really easy to acknowledge how other people might be biased, but we fail to realize how we ourselves are biased because we have this illusion that we see the world accurately, when in fact, the way that we see the world is colored by our conception of self, inevitably so. And I can demonstrate this in another way with a phenomenon known as the cocktail party effect. And you might have experienced this. So imagine you're at a party and you're having a conversation with someone, and there's all sorts of other people having conversations all around you, but you're not really paying attention to those people because you're having the conversation with your partner, with whoever you're talking to. And you don't hear a thing that anyone else is talking about because you're engrossed in your conversation. You don't hear a thing until someone says your name. And all of a sudden, you hear that, right? You didn't hear anything else they were talking about, but as soon as they mentioned your name, that oriented you. It's kind of as if your brain, at a level below your awareness, is always scanning the environment and trying to find instances where people are talking about you. And as soon as they find one, they're talking about me, that orients your attention. So this is another example where the self is sort of fundamental. The self determines, in a sense, how we pay attention to things or what things we pay attention to. So we can see how the self affects the memory, our perception of the world, how we pay attention to things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Understanding behavior requires us to understand the self, how our perceptions are skewed, et cetera. And this is why it's the first topic I talk about in social psychology. What I would like you to do for 30 to 40 seconds is to fill in this blank. I want to know what you think about yourself. So the only requirement for filling in this blank with five responses is that they have to be true responses. Other than that, you can answer, fill in that blank with whatever you want. And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or so to do this right now because I want to see whether the ways in which you respond correlate to the ways in which people normally respond to these questions. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds starting now. Okay. I gave you a little bit longer than 30 seconds. If you're not quite done yet, feel free to pause the video and finish responding, and then come back. But I want you to take a look at your list of how you responded to this question because there's certain types of responses that people often give. And I want to see if these refer to you as well, if you responded in these typical ways. And I want to make 5 points here. The first is that when people respond to this question, they usually respond to it in ways that differentiate themselves from other people. So, for example, you could have responded with, I am a human, I am an FIU student, I am a male or female or whatever. Um, And maybe you did, but most people tend not to do that because it doesn't really differentiate them from other people. So people usually try to find things that make them somewhat unique. Part of that is a function of the fact that we like to think that we're unique in Western cultures. And this is an idea we're going to come back to later on. Second point I want to make is that if you listed things like I am generous or I'm intelligent or I am funny or I am strong or I'm independent or things of that nature, what you're really saying when you say I am intelligent, what you're effectively saying is that compared to most people, I am intelligent. When you say you are brave, what you're saying is compared to most people, I am brave. In other words, as we are going to see later on, we define ourselves in relation to other people. And this is going to be an important point later on because what we're going to see is that you could change someone's social environment without changing them. And that could have drastic changes to the way that they view themselves, not because they have changed, but because their social environment has changed. So we're going to also come back to that point a little later on as well. The third point I want to make is that if you look over your list, your five answers that you gave, chances are the majority of you tended to list traits. You tended to say things like I'm intelligent or brave or I am trustworthy or generous or studious or whatever, right? You're probably listing personality traits. It turns out, and what could be more natural, right? In this culture, in Western cultures, we tend to think of ourselves as a collection of personality traits. But it turns out that that is not inherent to being human. And in fact, people from more Eastern cultures explicitly do not do this. They do not tend to think of themselves as a collection of traits, but rather they tend to think of themselves in relation to other people. So I am a brother, or I am a friend, or I am a cousin, or things of that nature. We're going to look at that later on as well. But the point I want to make there, or the point I will make, is that part of how we see ourselves, how we come to know ourselves, is culturally based as well. It doesn't feel like that, right? It feels like what could be more natural in describing ourselves in terms of personality traits. But what we don't realize is that that is partly a fact that we were born in this culture. If you had been born in a different culture, you would inherently think of yourself in a different way. So you can see how even our perceptions of ourselves um, are influenced by where we grew up, right? They're not like objective features necessarily. Fourth point I want to make is that if you do look at the traits that you did list, the majority of you probably listed positive traits as opposed to negative traits. In other words, you tend to get things like I'm intelligent, or I'm courageous, or I'm generous, or I'm honest. And you tend to not get a lot of responses like I am unintelligent, or I am dishonest, or I am cowardly, or things that have a negative connotation to them. Now, you could have responded that way, but chances are you didn't. And that is also very, very commonly reflected in Western cultures. This is how people tend to think of themselves. We tend to think of ourselves really, really highly for the most part. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture, so we will come back to that later on. But the fifth point, and the one I want to focus on right now, is that when you said that you were intelligent and generous and brave or whatever you said, how do you know that? How did you come to those answers? How do you know who you are? And it seems like a weird question, right? I mean, you're you. Of course, you know who you are. You just have that access to that information about who you are. Like, what could be simpler than that? Well, I'm going to argue that things aren't so simple. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, you don't know yourself as well as you think you do. I'm going to argue that some of the traits you listed that you have, maybe you don't have as strongly as you think. And in fact, maybe you have traits you're not even aware of. But that's going to require a little bit of groundwork to build up. So give me a little while I build up that groundwork. Now, if we take the entire topic of the self, we can break it down into what's often referred to as the ABCs of the self. Here's what I mean by that. The A stands for the affective component of the self. When we talk about affect in psychology, we're usually talking about how we feel about something. So the affective component of the self would refer to how we feel about ourselves, how we evaluate ourselves. What is our self-esteem like? What are the consequences of raising or lowering self-esteem? Where does our self-esteem derive from? And these are questions that we are going to address in the next lecture. The B of the ABCs of the self refers to the behavioral component of the self. What this means is that you tend to behave differently in different contexts. We all tend to do this, right? When you go to a job interview, you're going to behave differently than when you're out with your friends. And the reason that you do that largely is because you want an interviewer to think different things about you than you want your friends to think about you. The interviewer, your potential employer, you want them to think that you are hardworking and punctual and reliable. With your friends, maybe you want them to think that you're a fun person to be with, right? And so, because of that, we tend to act differently in different situations. We present different aspects of ourselves in different types of contexts. And that's also something we are going to talk about in the next lecture. But for now, for this lecture, what I want to focus on is the cognitive component of the self. Cognitive meaning how do we think about ourselves, not how we feel or evaluate ourselves, but what sorts of qualities do we think we have? How do we come to know ourselves? How do we form a self concept? And this is what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this lecture, how we come to know ourselves. And we're going to see that things are maybe a little bit counterintuitive here. But what do I mean when I say self concept? Well, if I gave you an unlimited amount of time to answer that question, I am blank, and you gave me hundreds and hundreds of different responses, the sum total of everything you think about yourself, that's referred to as your self-concept. The sum total of all the beliefs that you have about your own personal attributes. It's just what you think about yourself, effectively. Now, babies, infants tend to form a self-concept sometime between 18 months and 24 months, usually around a year and a half or so. And the reason that we know this is because psychologists have developed a test for a self-concept. It's this. You can have a researcher interacting with a child, and they secretly mark that child just by touching his or her forehead with, let's say, a little bit of red paint or something like that. Now, the child doesn't know they have paint on them. And then after a while, you place that child in front of a mirror. Now, if the child recognizes that the image in the mirror is a representation of themselves, then they will recognize that, wait a sec, I have a green mark on my head, and they will go and touch that green mark. And so when you do that with infants, what you find is that around 18 months of age is when they start to realize that the thing in the mirror is them, and they touch that mark on their forehead. And in fact, it's not even humans that can do this. Certain animals can do this as well. So for instance, the great apes, chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, they can also pass this test as well. They will touch a mark. If they've seen themselves in the mirror before and they see themselves now with a mark, they will touch the mark. And that's an indication to us that they recognize that the thing over there is conceptually the same as this body here. That's actually quite a complicated cognitive task to do. And maybe that's why only a few animals tend to pass this test. The great apes, for instance, I believe there's a certain kind of elephant that can pass this test. There's dolphins that can pass this test, et cetera, et cetera. But that's how we operationalize. We talked about that in the last lecture, operational definitions. This is an example. This is how we operationalize or come up with an operational definition for self-concept. So if you think about your answers to these questions for a bit. So if I asked you, why did you come to Florida International University? You could come up with a list of reasons, right? Maybe it's because you got a scholarship. Maybe it's because it's close to home. Maybe it's because it's far away from home. Maybe you like the campus. Maybe the academic programs were particularly strong in your major. You can come up with all sorts of reasons for this, right? Similarly, if I asked you, for those of you who have romantic partners, why did you fall in love with your partner? You can come up with a list of reasons for this as well. And when you ask people this, they'll tend to give you things like, they see me for who I am, or they have a really great sense of humor, or they treat me well, or things of that nature, right? It's pretty easy. And you could come up with your own reasons for why you fell in love with your partner. Or if you have a preference for Coke versus Pepsi, I could ask you why you have that preference. Why do you prefer Coke over Pepsi or vice versa? And when I ask students in my class this, the responses I typically get are things like, well, I think Pepsi is sweeter than Coke, or Pepsi has more carbonation than Coke, or vice versa, or things of that nature. But again, I want to ask you the question of how do you know these things? How do you know that the real reason you fell in love with your partner was because they have a good sense of humor and it wasn't something else? How do you know that the real reason you preferred Pepsi over Coke was due to the carbonation or the sweetness and not something else? In fact, let me give you a counterexample. Coke and Pepsi spend millions and millions of dollars every year in advertising, and the reason is because advertising works. Part of the reason people like to drink that soft drink is because they've been exposed to advertising for it. And yet, when you ask them the question, why do you drink one soft drink over another? Almost no one will say because of advertising. Now, people will recognize that advertising can affect other people, but we don't recognize how it can affect us, even though it clearly does, or else Coke and Pepsi wouldn't spend so much money advertising. But the fact that almost no one comes up with that as a reason for why they prefer one soft drink or another is suggesting that we're not always aware of the factors that are influencing our preferences for something. This is the general theme that I'm going to be talking about today. So, where does the self come from? How do you know about yourself? How do you know what your traits are? How do you know why you fell in love with your partner, et cetera, et cetera? How do you come to know your own attitudes, your opinions, your motivations? And we're going to specifically talk about four possible ways. But the first way, through an introspective process, is the most intuitive way that most people think we come to know ourselves. What introspection means is that if I ask you who you are, well, you have that information already, right? You just have that at your disposal. You know who you are. You just go inside yourself, you pull it out like, this is who I am. Of course, you know it. But I'm going to argue that, in fact, we don't know ourselves through a process of introspection. And not only that, but when you have people introspect, when you have people think about who they are, the more they think about it, the less they know who they are, or the less accurate they are. And in fact, I'm going to argue that the next three bullet points that I have on this slide are actually ways that we come to know ourselves that are much more influential than the thing that we think, the way that we think we know ourselves via introspection. So let's talk about each one of these in turn. We're going to start by talking about introspection, how we really think we come to know ourselves. And what I'm going to argue is that we often know the outcomes of some cognitive process, meaning we know that we're in love with our partner. We know that we came to FIU. We know that we prefer Pepsi over Coke. But what I'm going to argue is that we don't often know the cognitive processes that led us to that outcome. We don't know how we got there, in a sense. We think we do. When you ask people why they fell in love with their partner, no one says, I don't know. And there's good reasons for that. If your partner asks you why you love them, it's a good idea. Don't say, I don't know. It's not a good idea to do that, right? You will give a reason, right? But truthfully, scientifically speaking, the correct answer might be, I don't know. And for reasons that we're going to get into as we progress with this lecture. But people readily give these wrong explanations for their behavior. Almost no one says, I don't know, right? So why is it that, first off, we don't know ourselves? And I'm going to give you some evidence that we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. But why is it we don't know ourselves? And if that's the case, why are we giving answers? Why are we giving explanations for our behavior or reasons for our preferences? We're going to answer both of these questions in the next few minutes. But let me start by giving you some data that suggests that we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And first, I want to talk about how sometimes we think something influenced us that in fact did not influence us. In other words, we overemphasize the influence of some factor on our behavior. I'll describe two studies that demonstrate this. In this first study, what researchers did is they had participants record on a diary for 2 weeks what their mood was on every day for those 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, they returned the diaries back to the researchers. And when they returned them, the researchers said, thank you for doing this. Now, I know that, it's possible that mood might influence people's, or the weather might influence people's moods. So we want to factor that in when we look at your diary. So let me ask you a question. Did the weather affect your mood in the past couple of weeks? And most people say, well, yeah, it did. I mean, I was happy on sunny days and I was sadder on rainy days. And yeah, the weather influenced my mood. That makes sense, right? Well, the researchers for the prior 2 weeks had been keeping track of the weather every day. So what they can do is they can go into people's journals, their diaries, and they can see if there's a correlation between what their self-reported mood is and what the actual weather was that day. If people are right that the weather does affect their mood, they should report being happier on sunny days and sadder on rainy days. And yet, when the researchers did this, what they found was there was no correlation whatsoever between what the weather was outside and people's self-reported happiness. In other words, the weather seemed to have virtually no impact on people's moods. But when you had asked them if the weather affected their moods, almost everybody says yes. And almost everybody seems to be wrong. They thought the weather influenced them when in fact it didn't. Or here's another study. Participants watched a movie in a room in one of two types of rooms. In the first, in the condition, they watched a movie in a relatively quiet room. And at the end of the movie, they were asked a series of questions, asking them things like, how much did you like the movie? That sort of thing. In the experimental condition, in the other condition, the other half of the participants had been randomly assigned to a condition in which they watched the movie in the same room, but now there's a really noisy power saw going off in an adjacent room. At the end of the movie, all the participants rated how much they liked the movie. And then the researchers asked them an additional question. They said, "We apologize. There's construction going on in the other room. Did that power saw did it affect your liking of the movie?" And the majority of people say, "Yes, it did affect my liking of the movie. Had that power saw not been going off, of course I would have liked the movie better." But the researchers can tell, they can assess this, right? Because they have a group of people who watched the movie without the noisy power saw going off. So if the noisy power saw really made them like the movie less, then the group who heard the power saw should like the movie less than the people who didn't. And yet, when they do the analyses, what they find is there's basically no difference between these two groups. Both groups liked the movie equally well. In other words, the power saw didn't actually decrease their liking of the movie, despite the fact that the vast majority of people said that it did. They thought something influenced them that in fact didn't. So these are both examples where people are overemphasizing the influence of a factor on their behavior. They're thinking something influenced them that in fact did not. But sometimes we see the exact opposite. Sometimes people underemphasize the influence of some factors on their behavior. In other words, something that did influence us, we think it didn't influence us. Here's an example. Some researchers went to a shopping mall and they had a long table there. And on that table, they laid out four pairs of pantyhose. Now, they weren't in their boxes like this, so you couldn't see the brand name. And they would stop people who were shopping in the mall and say, "Hey, we're doing some marketing research. Would you mind helping us out?" So people tend to agree. They say, "Sure, I'll help you out." And so the researchers say, "Look, I've got four pairs of pantyhose here. What I want you to do is look at each one. Feel free to pick them up and touch them and feel them. And just tell me which one is your favorite. Which one do you prefer?" So the participants start feeling and touching the four pairs of pantyhose. Now, again, they don't know it's the exact same pair of pantyhose, right? They think they're all different. Now, for whatever reason, there tends to be this effect where people prefer the pair of pantyhose that are presented last. For whatever reason that is, there's kind of an order effect. So most people prefer the last pair they touched. So when they give their decision as to which pair of pantyhose they liked, the researchers ask them, "Okay, so why did you pick that pair of pantyhose? Why do you think that's the best pair?" And the participants would say things like, "Well, I like the color better, or I like the feel better. It was softer. It looked like it'd be less prone to ripping and tears. So it's like a higher quality material." Now, all of these reasons we know are completely wrong, right? They're completely made up because these are four pairs of identical pantyhose. So there were no differences in any of these things. So we're seeing, first of all, that people are thinking that their preferences were determined by these factors that in fact didn't influence them at all. But furthermore, at the end of the study, the researchers say, "Look, some people show a preference for the fourth pair of pantyhose like you did, just because it's the last one they touched. Do you think that your preference for that pair of pantyhose, do you think it was influenced by the order in which it was in?" And what do you think participants say? They say, "No, of course not. There's no way. I wasn't influenced by the order of the pair of pantyhose." But we know that a lot of them were, but no one actually says that they were, right? So in other words, a factor that did influence them, the positioning of the pantyhose, the order in which they touched them, that actually affected their preferences, people deny it. People underemphasize the influence of order on their preferences. So what's going on here? Well, what typically happens is that when you ask someone to explain why they like something, what their preferences are for something, the reasons that we give are not necessarily the true reasons because we lack the ability to know the true reasons that led us to like or dislike something. But rather, what we rely on are common sense ideas for why people like things. So, in other words, when I asked you, "Why did you fall in love with whoever?" you didn't necessarily go into yourself and say, sense of humor, that is the reason why I fell in love with them. Rather, what you did is you thought, well, people fall in love with each other for a variety of reasons, including having a good sense of humor. That's a common sense idea. And so, therefore, that must be the reason that I fell in love with my partner. And you reported that as a reason. I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong. I'm just saying that the way that you got to that conclusion is not through a process of introspection, but rather through the common sense ideas that you were taught via culture and socially for why people fall in love with other people. Similarly, when people are asked, did the mood affect your weather? Well, they didn't go inside themselves and know that the mood affected their weather, but rather they thought, well, it makes sense that the weather would affect someone's mood, and therefore it probably affected mine. And so, yeah, I was affected by the weather when in fact they weren't. It makes sense that a noisy power saw would influence their liking for a movie, right? That makes common sense. So people report that it did affect them. It doesn't really make common sense that the order of a pair of pantyhose would affect their likings of that pantyhose. So people deny that that affected them. Again, not because they know that, because clearly they didn't, but because it doesn't make common sense that the order would have affected them. So there's really two issues going on here, right? First off, we don't know the causes of our behavior or more generally the reasons behind our preferences. That's one problem. But the second problem is that we don't know those things. We think that we do know the true causes of our preferences, but it's all an illusion. Okay. The problem is that we don't know that we don't know. That's why people readily give these answers all the time because it feels like those are the true answers. We don't realize that in fact they're just common sense ideas that we're giving. So if we go back to these questions, as I mentioned before, what I would argue is that the way that you answer these questions is not through a process of introspection, but rather through these common sense ideas, because it makes sense that you would prefer Coke or Pepsi because one is sweeter than the other, or because of the carbonation content. We don't tend to think of things like advertising because although it makes sense that advertising affects other people, we all tend to think we're uninfluenced by advertising. So people don't report that. When you gave me reasons for why you came to FIU, you didn't necessarily give me the real reasons, or at least you didn't just know what the real reasons were. You gave me some common sense ideas for why people might go to FIU. When you gave me reasons for why you fell in love with your partner, you didn't necessarily give me the true reasons. You gave me common sense reasons for why people would fall in love with someone else. And again, I'm not saying the reasons you gave me were necessarily wrong. It's possible that the reasons you gave me were correct. It's just that the process that you used to come up with those reasons is not the process you think. You think it's not a process of introspection, but rather a process of sort of common sense deduction. But it gets worse than that. Not only do we not know the causes of our behaviors or the reasons for our preferences, but if you force people to introspect, you deliberately, explicitly have them think about those reasons, they tend to make worse decisions. The more people think about why they like something, the less they know whether they like it. And I want to give you a couple of research examples so you can see what I mean. In this first study, and you don't need to know the authors, the dates for tests, but in this first study, what researchers did is they ran a study in which participants tasted a variety of different jams. Now, they were randomly assigned to one of two groups. So some people would taste the jam, then they were told they had to list reasons for their preferences. They had to, okay, tell me why you like or dislike the jam. So they would say things like, I like the sweetness, or it was a little bit tart, or I like the texture, or I didn't like the color, or whatever it is, right? And some people, the other half of the participants, only tasted the jams, but did not list any reasons for why they liked them or not. Afterwards, everybody rates the jams. You have to rate them on a scale. How much did you like the jam? Now, what the researchers did is they took participants' ratings of how much they liked the jam, and they compared them to professional taste testers. And what they showed is that among the group of people who did not list their reasons, they simply tasted the jam and then they rated it, how much they liked it. Their ratings more or less mapped on to the ratings of professional taste testers. That's good. That's what we might expect, right? But what's more interesting is what happens when you look at the people who listed their reasons for why they liked each jam and only then rated if they liked it. When you look at their ratings, they no longer correspond to the ratings of professional taste testers. Another way of saying this is that the act of thinking about why they liked the jams led them to not know if they liked the jams, which is very counterintuitive, right? If you want to come up with the reasons for why you like something, you might think about it in depth and come up with these reasons. What this is saying is that that's the worst thing you can do. The very act of thinking about why you like something is harming your ability to know whether you like it. Okay, fine. But this is just jam tasting, right? Like, who cares? So let's try a different context. What these researchers did is they looked at people who were in dating relationships and they would take people into their lab one at a time, and they randomly assigned them to one of two groups. For half the students, they were told to give reasons for why they liked their dating partner, just like I did a few minutes ago. Why'd you fall in love with your partner? I fell in love with them because their sense of humor and they're good to me and all those sorts of things. So people could come up with a list of reasons for why they like their partner. The other half of the students did not give any reasons for why they like their partner at all. So again, this is a manipulation of whether you are forcing people to introspect about why they like something or not introspect. And then afterwards, everybody rates how satisfied they are in their relationship. On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you, right? If you're very satisfied, you give a 9 or 10. If you're not very satisfied, maybe you give a 2. Well, the researchers followed up with these couples over the course of the next few months. And of course, in that time, some of those couples had broken up and some of them had stayed together. So, what the researchers can do is they could correlate people's satisfaction ratings that they gave in the lab with whether they stayed together or not. Because you would expect that people who give high satisfaction ratings at time one would be more likely to stay together with their partner at time two, 3 months later, compared to people who gave low satisfaction ratings at time one, who are more likely to break up with their partner. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, that is what happened among participants in the control condition. The participants who did not give reasons for why they liked their partner, that's exactly what happened. Their satisfaction ratings were related to whether they stayed together or not, as you'd expect. But the much more interesting finding is if you look at the students who first gave reasons for why they liked their partner and then rated how satisfied they were, their satisfaction ratings did not correlate with whether they stayed together or not over the next few months. Another way of saying this is that the act of thinking about why you liked your partner led you to not know how satisfied you were with your partner. This should seem a little odd to most people, right? It seems as if we would want to think about reasons why we like or dislike something to really know whether we like or dislike it. And this is showing the exact opposite, that it seems like the more you think about it, the worse your decisions are. So I guess the question is, why does introspection fail? Why is this not a good strategy for learning about ourselves? Well, typically what happens is this: if you make someone come up with reasons for why they like something, they have to verbalize those reasons. Well, the reasons they come up with, as I mentioned a minute ago, are not the real reasons, but they're based on common sense ideas, right? But those common sense ideas aren't necessarily accurate. You may think that you fell in love with your partner because of their sense of humor, but in reality, maybe the reason you fell in love with them was something that was a little harder to put into words. We just have chemistry with people, right? And it's hard to describe that chemistry. It's hard to put that into words. And so when you ask people to generate reasons, because it's hard to put the chemistry into words, they rely on things like sense of humor or generosity or things like that. But those are often the wrong reasons. And therefore, they start ignoring the true reasons for why they fell in love with their partner, say. Those reasons are often non-verbalizable. We just get a feeling, a warm, fuzzy feeling when we're with our partner, but we can't really explain it necessarily, right? And so, because people are verbalizing wrong reasons and they're ignoring the true reasons for why they fell in love with someone or for why they prefer something, they're relying on the wrong reasons. If you then ask them to rate how satisfied they are in the relationship, they start relying on the reasons they had just verbalized, which, as we just established, are often wrong. And they start ignoring the true reasons, their gut feelings, which are often right. Think of it this way. Let's say that you're dating someone, right? And on paper, they're amazing. They're good looking, they're intelligent, they're really nice, they're fun to be with, et cetera, et cetera. But you just lack that chemistry with them, right? You just don't click in the way that you click with other people. So if I ask you to verbalize, why did you fall in love with your partner? It's an easy task. You can list all these reasons, right? They're intelligent, they're good looking, they're generous, they're nice, all these sorts of things. Easy to list those reasons. And then I ask you, how satisfied are you in that relationship? And you start thinking, well, I just came up with a list of 10 reasons why I like my partner, and it was really easy to do. So I guess I must be really satisfied in this relationship. But the problem is you weren't satisfied in that relationship. The reason you came to that wrong conclusion is because you relied on this list of personality traits, which weren't the real reasons why you fell in love with them. And you started ignoring that gut feeling, the feeling that you just didn't click. You ignored that. As a consequence, you came to the wrong conclusion. You thought you were satisfied when in fact you weren't. Or vice versa, maybe you have great chemistry with someone, you just click with them perfectly. But on paper, they don't look so good. They're not really physically attractive and they're not the most intelligent. And they don't really get along with a lot of people, maybe, and they're not really all that generous. But for some reason, you click with them, right? So when I force you to verbalize reasons, why do you like your partner? You struggle to come up with even two reasons, right? It's hard to come up with those reasons. So I later ask you, how satisfied are you in the relationship? And you say, oh my God, I couldn't even come up with two reasons why I like my partner. I guess I'm not satisfied at all. But again, you reach the wrong conclusion because in reality, you are satisfied with them. Your gut, that click, that chemistry that you have with them, that leads to your satisfaction. But because you ignored that, because you only relied on the verbalizable information, you thought you weren't satisfied when in fact you were. That's why the act of forcing people to introspect about these things can backfire, can lead people to the wrong conclusions. But keep in mind that this is only true for effective decisions, meaning when we're talking about why we like something or why we prefer something, it is much better to go with your gut than to go with your head because your head doesn't know, your gut knows. Okay. But there are other types of decisions that aren't effective. If you're deciding which stock you should invest in, that's more of a cognitive decision. You've got to think about things then, right? So I'm not saying thinking is bad, right? Thinking is good when the decision you're making is more cognitive in nature, more logical in nature. But thinking can be bad when our outcome variable is what we like. It's hard to reason our way into why we like something. It's just that our gut just kind of knows. And so this brings up an important question. Let's say you're debating between two things. Which school should I go to? Which person should I date? Which car should I buy? Whatever. One of the strategies that people often use is to come up with a list of pros and cons, right? For each option, you see which list is longer to help make your decision. Now, is that a good strategy? Well, based on what I've been talking about here, that is a horrible strategy to make. In fact, you would be better off doing nothing than making a list of pros and cons. Because when you make a list of pros and cons, you can, by definition, only list things that are verbalizable, right? And those aren't the true reasons why you like or dislike something. So then you start relying on your list, your pros and cons list, which is not the real reason. You should be relying on your gut, but you're now relying on the wrong reasons to make your decisions. So you're literally better off doing nothing than making a list of pros and cons when you're making an effective decision, what you like or what you prefer. So that's why introspection doesn't really work very well at leading us to know who we are. So how else do we know who we are? Well, let me ask you a question first off. I want you to imagine two different worlds. And in these two worlds, they're exactly identical, except for one thing. In world A, you make $50,000 a year at whatever job it is that you do, and everyone else in the world makes $25,000 a year. In world B, you live in a world where you make $100,000 a year, and everyone else makes $250,000 a year. Now, everything else is identical between these worlds, prices, everything else. And the question is, which of these two worlds do you prefer? Which would you rather live in? I want you to think about this for just 1 second. Okay, so hopefully you have picked one or the other, because we're going to come back to this in just a second. So let's look at the second way that we might come to know ourselves, and that's through perceptions of other people's behavior. Leon Festinger is one of the most famous social psychologists in all of social psychology, and he came up with this theory called social comparison theory. Social comparison theory is often called the social psychologist's second favorite theory, and their first favorite theory is another theory that Leon Festinger came up with that we're going to talk about later. But this is a hugely influential and important idea in the history of social psychology. And what social comparison basically says is that we evaluate our abilities, we evaluate ourselves, we learn about what we're good or bad at or who we are, not through introspection, but by comparing ourselves to other people. So, for instance, if on the first exam you get an 85%, Question is, are you happy with that grade? And for a lot of you, you may not really know yet because you feel like you need more information. Specifically, how did everybody else do in the exam? I mean, if everyone else got a 98% and you got an 85, you're probably not so happy. But if everyone else got a 55% and you got an 85, you're probably pretty happy with the grade that you got, right? What that means is your emotional reaction depends not just on your grade, but the grade of other people as well. And similarly, the way we learn about ourselves, the conclusions we draw about the type of person we are, also depends on those same comparisons. I mean, if you get 85% and everyone else gets 98, you may think you're not a very good student. But if you get 85 and everyone else gets 55, you may think you're a really good student. You really know the material. Your scores are exactly the same in both of those situations, but your perceptions of yourself are different based on how everyone else performed as well. This is why when you get your exam score back in almost any class, one of the first questions people ask is, what was the average? Because you want to know how to compare your score to other people's scores. We don't always have to do this, right? Some of the times we already know what we're like. I've got a PhD in social psychology. I already know that I understand social psychology. So I don't have to be comparing myself all the time to figure out how much I know about social psychology. But there's a lot of areas in which I'm very uncertain about my abilities. And under those conditions where I don't really know how to evaluate myself, I don't really know how good I am at something, those are times of uncertainty. That's when we tend to use social comparison to try to learn something about ourselves. Another important question is, with whom do we compare? I mean, you've got a classroom of people that you can compare yourself with. So which person are you going to compare yourself with? Well, this sort of depends on your motivation. For now, we're going to assume that your motivation is to find accurate information about yourself. You want to learn about who you are. You want to know what your skills or abilities are in some area. And if your motivation is to be accurate, then typically what we're going to do is compare ourselves with similar other people, people who went through similar circumstances as us. If you studied for, let's say, 4 hours before the exam and you get an 85%, you're not going to compare your score to someone who never went to class, never bought the textbook, never saw any lectures, and never studied, because of course you did better than them. That doesn't give you any information. And you're also not going to compare your abilities to, let's say, the TA's abilities in the class if the TA took the exam, right? Because the TA probably has taken social psychology before and is probably going to know more than you. Again, that doesn't give you any information. What we are going to do, on the other hand, is compare ourselves with people who are similar to us. We want to compare ourselves to people who went to the same number of classes as we did, who studied for about the same amount of time. That gives us the most information because if we did better than them, then maybe it's because we're good at that. We have good skill. If we did worse than them, that tells us maybe we don't have a great skill in that topic. So we try to compare ourselves with similar other people under the condition in which we're trying to find accurate information. But it turns out, oftentimes, we're not looking for accurate information. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. So we're going to come back to this idea of social comparison then. Oftentimes, this information you get through this process of social comparison, that's what I'm calling relative information, how you performed relative to someone else. That is often more important in determining your self-concept, how you think of yourself, than is more absolute information. Absolute information, for example, would be, what score did you get on the exam? Relative information is, how did you do in relation to other people? So, for example, there's a study conducted where people had to judge various pieces of art. So they were shown a piece of art and they had to say, do you think this is painted by painter A or painter B? And they had to do that repeatedly. And you can imagine that students aren't really very good at this on average, right? So the researcher, they leave at the end of the task, they leave the room to calculate the participant's score. In reality, they're not calculating anything. But what they're going to do is that in a minute, they're going to come back to the participant and they're going to give them some bogus feedback, some fake feedback. These participants have been randomly assigned to one of a couple conditions. First off, participants are randomly told that they either got 40% correct or they got 60% correct. That's a manipulation of the absolute information, right? You either got 40 or 60%. That changes how well you actually did on the task. Furthermore, participants were also randomly assigned to be told that whatever their score was, whether it was 40 or 60, was either above average or it was below average. So in that way, there are four groups of people, right? There's people who were told they got 40% correct, which was above average, people who were told they got 40%, which was below average, people who were told they got 60%, which was above average, or people who were told that were 60, they got 60%, which was below average. So afterwards, everybody then has to rate how good are you at this task? How good are you at sorting this sort of art? Now, what the researchers showed is that it didn't matter whether you told people they got 40% or 60%. That had almost no influence on people's evaluations of themselves, which seems counterintuitive, right? You would think that if you're told you got 60% right, of course you're going to think you're better at this than if you're told you got 40% right. But that's not the information people used. Rather, what they did is they used the relative information. People who were told they did better than others thought more highly of their own abilities than people who were told they did worse than others. That's all that mattered. And what that means is that they have people who were told they got 40%, but it was above average. They rated themselves as better at this task than people who were told they got 60%, but that was below average. So we learn about ourselves by constantly comparing ourselves to others. And this gets back to that point I made when you filled in that blank, I am blank. When you said you were intelligent, what you really meant was compared to most people, I'm intelligent. When you said you were generous, what you mean is that compared to most people, you are generous. And what all of this means is that I can change your perception of who you are, not by changing you, but by changing your social environment. So, for instance, let's say that in high school, you did really well compared to everybody else in your class, right? And because you did well compared to them, you thought really highly of your academic abilities. And then you graduate and you go to college. And suddenly there's all sorts of other smart people around as well, right? And now suddenly you're not doing so well in your classes. You're not at the top of the class anymore. You're closer to the bottom. And now because you're doing worse relative to everybody else, you now tend to think you don't have very strong academic abilities. Now, what happened here? Your academic abilities didn't change. What happened is the people you compared yourself with changed. In high school, because you compared yourself with people worse off, you thought you were good at something. In college, because you were comparing yourself to people who were better off, you thought you were worse at that same task. That's how social comparison changes the way that we think about ourselves. So, all of this is saying that the self, how you think about yourself, is defined in relation to other people. This is, as I said, is a really important concept and a really important theory in social psychology. And we're going to come back and look at some other implications of social comparison in the next lecture. So if we go back to this question I asked you a few minutes ago, which world would you rather live in? What typically happens is that when you ask people, a bunch of people this question, you get roughly a 50-50 split. About half of the people prefer world A and about half of the people prefer world B. But that's a little bit odd. I mean, it makes sense, I think, why people would pick world B, right? Because you're making 100,000. You're only making $50,000 in world A. So of course you have double your salary in world B. Like, of course, B makes a lot of sense, right? So why is it the case that about 50% of people prefer world A? Why are they willing to take a $50,000 per year pay cut? Over the course of 20 years, that's $1 million they're sacrificing to live in world A. Why do they like it? Well, because in world A, you only make 50,000, but everyone else is only making 25,000. So compared to them, you're doing pretty good, right? You feel rich compared to them. But in world B, even though you objectively make more money, because everyone else makes $250,000, you're not doing anywhere close to as well as everybody else. This is a process of social comparison. Now, this outcome maybe wouldn't make a lot of sense to an economist because an economist tends to believe that people behave in their rational self-interest. And so, of course, they should live in world B because who cares how much everyone else makes? All that matters is how much you make. So, of course, people should prefer world B. But to a social psychologist, the reason why some people pick world A makes a lot of sense because there's a psychological benefit to feeling like we're better than other people or that we make more money than other people. And in fact, that psychological benefit to feel like we're superior to others is so strong that in this case, over 20 years of working, people are willing to sacrifice $1 million just to feel that they're better than other people. That's how strong this motivation to want to positively socially compare to other people is. And in fact, we can use social comparison in other ways as well. A sociologist did kind of an interesting study about 10 years ago. He was interested in what makes us happy. And there are, of course, a lot of different factors that make us happy, but specifically, he was interested in the relationship between how often someone has sex and how happy they are. And what he showed is that happiness is related to how much sex you are having. In other words, people who had more sex tended to report being happier than people who had less sex. That may be intuitive. What's a little bit less intuitive is that happiness was also related to how much sex you think other people were having. So, in other words, if you thought people were having a lot of sex all the time, you were less happy in your sex life than if you thought people were having a lot less sex, in which case you were happier about your sex life. This should sound a lot like a social comparison process, right? That we compare ourselves to other people. And if we compare favorably, because we're having more sex than they are, we feel happy. If we compare unfavorably, because we think they're having more sex than we are, we feel unhappy. In other words, our happiness with our sex lives depends on a social comparison process. And what that means is that if you want to improve your sex life, there's two ways you can do it. First off, you can have more sex. Okay, that would do it. But that can be a little bit difficult, right? The second way to do it, which is a lot easier, is to realize that people don't have sex as much as you think they do. Because we are constantly inundated with messages from movies and TV where people are always sleeping around, right? And because we're always inundated with those messages, it feels like everybody's having sex all the time. But what they show on TV, that's not an actual representation of the frequency with which people have sex. And in fact, people don't have sex nearly as much as they do on TV. And once we realize that people are having less sex than we think, we become happier in our own sex lives because we compare more favorably, right? So this is how the professor who did the study summarized it. Having more sex makes us happy, but thinking that we are having more sex than other people makes us even happier. Okay. So your happiness is based not just on the objective features of your situation, but also on these evaluations, these comparisons you make between yourself and other people. And this is all similar, this social comparison process, to some other types of findings as well. So, for instance, what some researchers were interested in here is if you took people who are stressed out. So, what they did is they took people and they told them they were going to be receiving some injections. Now, for a lot of people, they get a little bit nervous about this because they don't know if it's going to hurt or not. They have no idea what's going to happen, right? And so the researchers gave them the option. Would you rather wait in this waiting room to get your shots alone or with someone else who's receiving a shot or with someone else who's not receiving a shot? And what they showed is that the people who are stressed out, they wanted to be with someone else, but only if that other person was also going to receive a shot. And this should make a little bit of sense. Because if you're waiting in a room and you're nervous, and this person that you're with is not nervous because they're not receiving a shot, you're not comparing favorably to them. We don't feel good about that, right? But if someone else is also receiving a shot, well, now we're kind of in the same boat. And one thing that we can do is we can learn how we should react, what emotion we should be experiencing by looking to other people. How nervous is that other person? If they're going to receive a shot, are they nervous as well? If they're really nervous, that tells me that maybe I should be really nervous. But if they're pretty calm, that tells me that maybe I can be calm. So, in other words, to some extent, our emotional reaction to things depends on a social comparison process as well. It depends on who we're around at any given time. So, what this means effectively, if you've heard of the saying, misery loves company, what they're concluding is that misery doesn't just love any kind of company, it loves only other miserable company, because that's what allows us to learn about how we should be feeling in that moment. And in fact, you can create entirely different emotions from people just by changing their social environment. Here's a classic study that looked at this. What these researchers did is they took participants and they injected them with adrenaline, basically. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to increase their physiological arousal, meaning it's going to make their heart beat faster, and they're going to get butterflies in their stomach, and they're going to be a little shaky. You feel different. You feel kind of up, right? Now, they're not told, though, that that's what they're injected with. They're told that this is a study on eyesight, and so this is going to help their eyesight. So what that means is that when this kicks in, let's say it takes 10 minutes to kick in, they're going to start feeling this physiological arousal that they don't know where it comes from. So what happens is that these researchers place participants in a room. And in this room, they're given a questionnaire that they have to fill out while they're waiting for the shot to kick in. Okay. Now, in the room, that where they're filling out this questionnaire, there's a confederate. This is someone who's working with the experimenter, who's pretending to be a participant, but in fact is not. And that confederate has been instructed to behave in one of two ways. So sometimes that confederate behaves in a very excited way. So they start making jokes and laughing and running around the room, and they start crumpling up paper and like tossing it into the trash bin like they're playing basketball, or they start folding up the paper into paper airplanes and throwing them around the room. There's like a hula hoop in the corner. This is the 1950s, so of course there's a hula hoop in the corner. They start playing with the hula hoop. They're acting really excited, right? On the other hand, the other half of the participants are placed in a room with a confederate who's behaving really angrily. So this person's going through the questionnaire and they're complaining about the questionnaire and they're complaining about the experimenter and they start saying things like, look at this question. They're asking me how many times my father's cheated on my mother. Like that's just totally inappropriate. Can you believe that they're doing this to us? And so they're getting angrier and angrier. And it's around this time that these participants are feeling this adrenaline, right? Now, when they have these symptoms, then they're feeling their heartbeat fast and they're getting nervous or whatever. They don't know what's causing it. So what they do is they look to their environment. So what happened is that when people were in a room with another Confederate who's behaving really excited, they reported feeling really excited themselves. But if the participants were placed in a room with someone who's behaving in a really angry fashion, they didn't report feeling excited, they reported feeling angry. In other words, the same physiological response produced two different emotions based on someone's social environment. This may go against how we normally think about emotions. We often think of emotions as just an objective physiological response to something. What this is saying is that that's not actually true. What emotions are, in part, is some sort of physiological response, but then we attach some sort of label onto it, which we get from our social environment. And so by changing aspects of the social environment, you could change the emotion that people are experiencing. And this is basically through a social comparison process, because we learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves with other people. Okay, so we learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves with other people. A second way we learn about ourselves is by perceiving our own behavior. So think about it this way, right? Let's say you had to try to figure out, um, so what is your best friend's favorite music? Now, the way you might do that is to say, well, let's see, they listen to country music every time I'm around them. So I infer that they must like country music. That's a logical inference. That makes a lot of sense, right? And you're probably going to be right. Now, that's not surprising. What's more surprising is that in the 1970s, a researcher came along and said, just like you do that for your friends, you do the exact same thing for yourself. In other words, when you're trying to figure out what your favorite music is, you don't know this through a process of introspection, but rather you think the same thing. You think, well, let's see. Every time I drive to work, I listen to heavy metal music. I must like heavy metal music. You're coming to a rational conclusion about what your preferences are, just like you would come to a rational conclusion about someone else, about what their preferences are. That's very counterintuitive, right? Specifically, what it's saying is that when internal cues are ambiguous, which basically means when we don't know already, you might have already thought about what your favorite music is, so you already know, right? But if those cues are ambiguous, we're not sure how we feel about something, then we learn about ourselves or we come to conclusions about ourselves by thinking about how we behaved in the past and coming up with a rational, logical conclusion on the basis of that. In other words, self-perception theory is all about how we make rational, logical inferences about what we must be like, right? This is saying we don't just know this, we don't have any awareness like in an introspective way about who we are. We come to rational conclusions about who we are based on thinking about or observing our past behavior. That's what self-perception theory is. Okay. So just to sort of show you the differences between how people normally think, right? If you ask people their favorite music, I just know I like heavy metal. That's through a process of introspection. And what self-perception theorists think we do is say, okay, well, how have I behaved in the past? Well, I've listened to a lot of heavy music in the past, so therefore I must like it. There's a logical conclusion that people are, an inference that people are reaching about themselves. Or if you're asked how you describe yourself, right? When you had to answer the I am blank question. If you said you're intelligent, maybe what you thought you did is you introspect and say, well, I just know I'm an intelligent person. I just inherently know that. But what a self-perception theorist says that you did instead is that you thought about in the past. People have called me intelligent in the past. I get good grades in all my classes. I read a lot of books. I have a good vocabulary. I guess I must be intelligent. You formed a rational inference that you're intelligent. You didn't just inherently know it. Self-perception theory is going to come back later in this course. It's actually a really, really important theory for various reasons. So we're going to see it come back. For now, just know that we can learn about ourselves by thinking about our own behavior and coming to rational conclusions. But we're going to expand upon that theory a little bit later on. And the idea that we can learn about ourselves by thinking about our own behavior is consistent with some other findings as well. So, for example, there's something known as the facial feedback hypothesis, which basically says that your mood is partly dependent on your face, your facial expression at any given time. In other words, if you smile, that can actually lead you to become happier. And if you frown, that can lead you to become sadder. I'll give you an example of what I mean. There's a study where people were told they had to watch a cartoon, and they were told they had to watch it in one of two ways. For some people, they were told they had to hold a pen in their mouth using only their teeth and not their lips. Now, the only way to do that is to do this. What that effectively does is it forces them to put a smile on their face. Now, you're not telling them that you're forcing them to put a smile on their face, but that's effectively what's happening. And the other group of people are told they have to hold a pen in their mouth while watching the cartoons using only their lips but not their teeth, which looks something like this. It sort of forces people to put a frown on their face. So this is how researchers manipulated whether people had a smile or a frown on their face without telling them to smile or frown. So after watching these cartoons, everybody rated how funny the cartoons were. And what they showed is that people who watched the cartoons who had this smile on their face because they're holding their pen with their teeth, they rated the cartoons as being funnier than people who watched the same cartoons but were holding the pen with their lips and not their teeth, who had a frown on their face. The idea being that your brain determined that these jokes were funnier because you had a smile. You must be happier, and therefore you must find these jokes funnier. It's kind of like your brain is always trying to read your face at all times to figure out what emotion you're having. And if it detects that you have a smile on your face, it says, ah, I'm happy, and it makes you happy. Okay, so that's a second way that we come to know about ourselves. The third and final way that we're going to discuss of how we come to know ourselves is through a cultural process, something that I alluded to earlier in this lecture. And in particular, what I want to talk about are differences between Western cultures, like the ones we live in. This would be like Canada and the US, Western Europe, etc., versus more Eastern cultures, which would be countries like China, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, etc. Those cultures differ in some very fundamental ways that change the way that people in those cultures perceive themselves. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So if you look at how you filled in this question, I am blank, right? As I mentioned before, people from Western cultures who have what's known as an individualist orientation, what that means is that we tend to think of ourselves as separate entities from everybody else, as individuals, okay? People with individualist orientations tend to answer with trait descriptions. I'm shy, I'm intelligent, I'm generous, I'm trustworthy, all of those personality characteristics that probably the majority of you answered the I am blank question with. But people from collectivist cultures, and in collectivist cultures, people tend to think of themselves less as individuals and more as interconnected with other people. And because of that difference in the way that they perceive themselves, they answer this question differently. They tend to answer this question with group affiliations that they have or relationships that they have. So I'm a brother, or I'm a part of a basketball team, or I'm a member of this organization, things of that nature. This is not just a difference in the way that we talk about ourselves. This is reflecting a deep, deep difference in how people perceive themselves within those two cultures. In this culture, we're effectively taught that we are a collection of personality traits. And so that's how we think of ourselves. In collectivist cultures, they're not taught the same thing. They're taught that who you are is very deeply interconnected with other people's connections are important. And so our entire conception of who we are is partly a function of the culture that we've grown up in. But the point is, we don't even realize this, right? What could be more natural than to think of ourselves as a collection of personality traits? That just feels inherently true. But in fact, it's very much cultural. And had you grown up in an Eastern culture, you would think of yourself very differently. And this is all because the self, how we think about ourselves, is determined in large part by the culture in which we have grown up in. And we don't even realize it. So let's talk a little bit more about differences between these two types of cultures because this idea is going to come back again at some points in the course. So if we first look at individualist cultures, Western cultures like this one, we have what's known as an independent self-concept. This gets at what I mentioned before, that we tend to think of ourselves as independent entities. So if I gave you a hypothetical, imagine that no one else was alive in the world. You're the only survivor in the world, okay? Now describe yourself. That shouldn't be a problem. You can easily do that. You still have the same traits that you have now, right? And that's because you can conceive of yourself as being independent from other people. But people in a collectivist culture, they have what's known as an interdependent self-concept. They define themselves in terms of others and the groups and the affiliations that they have with other people. And so if you tell them, okay, you're the only survivor in a cataclysmic event, you're the only person on Earth, and to describe yourself, that question doesn't make a lot of sense to them because they're defined in relation to other people. And if you take other people away, it's hard to define themselves at that point. And that's because they have this interdependent self-concept. They think of the affiliations they have more than just them as an individual person. And this has a lot of different implications because in individualist Western cultures, a lot of our own identity is based on our own personal achievements and our personal goals, right? That's how we define ourselves. I want to achieve something in life, and um, we that's part of who we are inherently, right? Whereas in collectivist cultures, the identity is based less on personal achievements and more on the success of the social groups that one belongs to. It's the group identity that matters more in a lot of cases than the individual identity. And so in individualist cultures, because our identity is based on our personal achievements, we're encouraged to validate the self, to do what we as individuals want to do. If you come from a family where your parents want you to become a doctor and you want to become a lawyer, in this culture, we'd say, do what you want to do. Your parents can't tell you what to do, right? So become a lawyer, do what you want to do. That's validating the self. But in collectivist cultures, they don't perceive things the same way. They might perceive that to be kind of selfish because people are interconnected with others. And so we should consider their opinions when deciding what we want to do. So, in other words, people are encouraged to restrain the self in order to fit in with the group. They're encouraged to, in this case, be a doctor. If your parents want you to become a doctor, you should take that into consideration because that's part of your social group and you can fit in better in that way. So in individualist cultures, because the focus is on the individual, we tend to disapprove of conformity. Now, that being said, we conform all the time in Western cultures. We'll get into that in the conformity lecture. But at least we pay lip service to this idea that conformity is a bad thing. And we have lots of negative terms for people who conform, like sheep or lemmings, things like that, right? Whereas in collectivist cultures, they tend to disapprove of egotism, that if you pursue what you want to do without consideration of what people in your social groups want to do, that's sort of a bad thing. That's sort of an egoistic thing to do. And they would strongly disapprove of that. Even the sayings we have in these different languages or different cultures reflect this underlying difference in how we see ourselves. So, for instance, in the English language, we have a saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In other words, if you stand out, good things will happen to you. It's encouraging you to be different from other people. Whereas in collectivist cultures, they have a saying that says, the nail that stands out gets pounded down. In other words, you shouldn't stand out in collectivist cultures. If you do, we're going to put pressure on you so that you conform to the group in general. So these are very fundamental differences in how people from these cultures perceive themselves. And so what it means is partly your perception of who you are is dependent on the culture that you grew up in. So how does the culture affect the self? Well, in a variety of ways. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In Western cultures, we tend to view ourselves as more unique than people in Eastern cultures. And in fact, it might even be threatening to people in collectivist Eastern cultures to think of themselves as unique because they often emphasize how well they can fit in with a group as opposed to how well they can stand out from a group, which is more what we emphasize in Western cultures. So our perceptions of the qualities that we have are going to vary depending on the culture that we come from. And in fact, there are complete emotions that differ between these two cultures based on this underlying difference in how we see ourselves. So, for example, in Western individualist cultures, we tend to express more what are called ego-focused emotions. These are emotions that are focused on our own goals or our desires. So things like jealousy, like the fear of losing something that you have, or pride, a sense of pride in accomplishments. It's a feeling good about something that you've accomplished. These are very ego-focused because they're focused on your needs and your wants. So we have more of those emotions, or we express more of those emotions in Western cultures than in Eastern cultures. Furthermore, in Eastern cultures, they have emotions that we don't even have words for in this culture. For instance, there's an emotion that's related to um, the feeling of being indebted to someone. You can see how that's focusing not on an individual need, but on a group, a collective need, right? I owe someone else money, and there's a feeling associated with that. And as far as I know, we don't have a word for that in this culture. And so the very emotions that we experience, again, are not objective, but are in part based in the culture in which we've grown up. The way that we strive for status differs across these cultures. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, in Western cultures, we tend to strive for status by achieving things at a personal level, by achieving our personal goals. That's what we focus on. Whereas in more Eastern cultures, they tend to focus less on personal achievements and more on group achievements. It's the team that matters more than the individual player. And if you're part of a group that succeeds, that is what they tend to want in more Eastern cultures. And this leads to some interesting differences between the cultures. So if you took, let's say, a basketball team from a Western culture, so you've got 5 players, and let's say they've just won a game, and you take those players after the game and you separate them, and you ask them, how much did you personally contribute to your team's win? Was it 10%? Was it 50%? Whatever. What happens is that if you take people's estimates and you add them all up, you almost always get a number greater than 100%. In other words, everyone thinks that they're the one who's primarily responsible for their team's win. They're biased in recollecting their individual contributions because that's what matters to people in this culture is our individual performance more than our team performance. Whereas in more Eastern cultures, they don't tend to show that bias. If you took 5 people from an Eastern culture who played and won a basketball game and separated them and asked them how much did you contribute to your team's win, you don't find the same effects. You don't find numbers that go above 100%. If anything, you find the opposite. The numbers are almost always less than 100% because it's not the individual performance that matters so much to people in Eastern cultures. It's the team, it's the group performance. And there's all sorts of other ways in which people from these two cultures differ because of this inherently different sense of self in which we have in these cultures. So just to summarize this section on the self, there's 2 main points that I hope I've gotten across to you. The first is that we simply don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. It feels as if we know who we are, and it feels as if I can easily describe myself, and it feels as if I can tell you what I like and don't like with 100% accuracy. But it turns out that a lot of what we say as the reasons for why we like something are just guesses based on common sense, which might happen to be right, but they're not necessarily right. And there's all sorts of things, all sorts of reasons for why we have certain feelings that we're simply unaware of. Okay. So we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And the second main point I want to make is that our self-concept, our ideas of who we are, it's not something that's stable and objective. You don't have one single, stable, objective self-concept. You have all these traits and none of these other traits. But rather, the self-concept we have is much more fluid and flexible. It changes depending on the situation. It fluctuates depending on the culture that we're a part of. It fluctuates depending on our social environment. We saw that with social comparison, that your perception of yourself, whether you think you're intelligent or not, depends not just on you, but on how you're comparing to other people in your social environment. So you change someone's social environment and you change their self-concept. So our self-concepts are always fluctuating over and over in all these different situations. So we have to stop thinking of the self-concept as being this objective construct and rather perceive that it's more fluid and more flexible than that. Okay. That's it for the first section on the self. We are going to continue talking about the self In next lecture, remember, we talked about the ABCs of the self. We've covered the C, the cognitive components of the self. Next lecture, we're going to cover the affective component and the behavioral component of the self. I'll see you then.